From a cook to a chancellor, this is something that actually happened in China 3,600 years ago. A slave-born cook helped a lord overthrow a tyrant and build a dynasty that lasted 600 years. Later, he locked up an unfit king, ran the country himself for 3 years, then handed the power back. No one killed him, no one even resented him. When he died, he was buried with honors reserved for emperors. His name was Yi Yin. Yi Yin was a foundling, discovered inside a hollow mulberry tree and adopted by a cook serving the Yuxin clan. He had no family name, no status. When he grew up, he inherited his foster father's trade and spent his days tending fires and chopping vegetables in the clan chief's kitchen. In that era, a person like him had no future worth imagining. Chop, stir, serve, grow old beside the stove. But Yi Yin was different from the others. Why, no one could say. Perhaps some people are simply born with an extra string in their minds that others don't have. Other cooks finished chopping and moved on. Yi Yin would wonder why a certain ingredient needed to be sliced thin instead of cut into strips, why the same piece of meat tasted completely different with a different cut. Other cooks tended the fire and thought nothing of it. Yi Yin would stare at the flames and puzzle over why the same bundle of wood produced entirely different heat depending on whether it burned, smothered, or open. He had an instinctive sensitivity to the invisible rules behind things, the way some people are born with perfect pitch, the way others see patterns in numbers before they're taught. Yi Yin was born sensitive to the question, why? His attention was like a beam of light, locked intensely on whatever caught his interest, extraordinarily deep, extraordinarily narrow. So from the very beginning, his cooking was different. He wasn't performing labor. He was decoding a system. And once a person gets used to looking at things on the level of underlying principles, it becomes very hard to keep his eyes on just the pot in front of him. He began thinking about the world beyond the kitchen. He studied how the ancient sage kings Yao and Shun governed their people, how Yu the Great allocated land and labor. No one taught him any of this. For a slave, thinking about such things served no practical purpose, but he couldn't stop. What drove him wasn't loyalty. He had no one to be loyal to. It wasn't ambition either. A slave couldn't even dream of becoming a minister. It was something more instinctive. He felt he understood how things worked, and a person who understands cannot bear to do nothing. The world at that moment happened to be deeply sick. The Shang Dynasty had passed into the hands of its last ruler, King Ji, and had rotted from the inside out. Ji was lost in pleasure, killed ministers on a whim, and the lords across the land bowed to him in public while plotting behind his back. Among those lords, one caught Yi Yin's attention, Tang, the leader of the Shang clan. Yi Yin noticed him not because he was the strongest, but because he possessed a rare quality, restraint. Tang had the power to strike, yet held back. Yi Yin recognized in that restraint something very much like himself. No impulsiveness, no recklessness, a feel for timing, like a cook who truly understands heat, knowing when to blast the flame and when to lower it. The problem was, how does a slave get an audience with a lord? Yi Yin found a way. The Yuxin clan was marrying off a daughter to Tang, and custom required sending a group of slaves as part of the dowry. Yi Yin volunteered to be one of them. He packaged himself into a wedding gift. Think about that for a moment. A man with ambitions for the entire realm, willing to let himself be delivered like a piece of property, just to get close to his target. He knew exactly what he was worth. That was precisely why he didn't care what others thought of him for the time being. Once in Tang's household, Yi Yin was assigned to the kitchen. It was the perfect position, close enough to the center of power, yet invisible. No one suspects a cook. He began to speak through food. Sometimes the dishes he prepared were deliberately too salty, sometimes too bland. Tang noticed and summoned him. This was exactly the moment Yi Yin had been waiting for. He didn't talk about politics or military strategy, he talked about cooking. A great dish, he said, isn't about how rare the ingredients are, it's about how you balance them. Sweet can't overpower sour, sour can't drown out sweet. Every flavor has to find its place without suppressing the others. Only then do you get a perfect broth. but that demands an exquisite sense of timing, when to blast the heat to draw out flavor, when to simmer low and slow. Miss by even a little and the whole thing falls apart. As Tang listened, he realized this cook wasn't talking about food. The sweet and the sour were rival factions. The heat was the moment to strike. That perfect broth was a stable kingdom. A slave, using the language of the kitchen, had articulated the core logic of governance. What truly moved Tang wasn't just the content, it was what the act itself revealed. How many years must this man have spent in that kitchen, thinking, to make something this profound sound this effortless? A person with that kind of patience could be trusted. Tang made a decision that had almost no precedent. He appointed a slave-born cook as his most important strategist. Yi Yin devised the strategy to overthrow the Shang Dynasty. Not a frontal assault, first, dissolution. He had Tang stop paying tribute to King Jia to test the reaction. Ji was furious and rallied the lords to punish Tang. Yi Yin then had Tang immediately resume tribute and apologize. This wasn't weakness, it was a test to see how many lords would still fight for Ji. The answer made the situation clear. The hearts of the realm had already turned. When the time was truly ripe, Tang marched. The Jia fell in a single campaign. It was clean, decisive, because the outcome had been settled before the battle ever began. Just like Yi Yin's cooking, everything was prepared long before the final burst of flame. The Shang Dynasty was established. Yi Yin became its highest official. But if the story ended here, he would simply be a successful strategist. China had no shortage of those. What made him truly one of a kind was what came next. After Tang's death, the throne eventually passed to his grandson, Taijia. Taijia was young and reckless, sinking into indulgence, showing every sign of becoming the next Ji. Yi Yin tried to counsel him more than once. It didn't work. He faced an extreme choice. He could do nothing and watch the dynasty he helped build decay. He could depose Taijia and take the throne himself. With his prestige, no one could have stopped him. But Yi Yin chose a path no one had walked before. He sent Taijia to Tong Palace beside Tang's tomb to reflect on his failures. Then Yi Yin governed the country in his place. He didn't abolish the king. He didn't seize the crown. He simply pressed pause. 3 years later, Taijia genuinely changed. Yi Yin then made a decision that may have been harder than overthrowing the Xia. He gave the power back. The next several thousand years of Chinese history proved again and again that power is an addiction, nearly impossible to relinquish once tasted. Wang Mang wouldn't give it back. Cao Cao wouldn't give it back. Sima Yi wouldn't give it back, but Yi Yin did. Perhaps because what he sought was never power itself. All those years in the kitchen, what drove him wasn't, "I want to be the most powerful man in the land." It was, "I want to see these principles put into practice." Power was his instrument, not his purpose. When it was time to return it, he could let go. Yi Yin lived to roughly 100 years old. He was buried with the rights of an emperor, the highest honor a subject could receive. From foundling to imperial burial, that road took an entire lifetime. But what's most worth remembering isn't how far he traveled. It's the choices he made at every fork. As a slave, he refused to accept his fate. At the center of power, he refused to be consumed by it. When he could have crowned himself king, he didn't reach. When it was time to step aside, he didn't hesitate. Centuries later, a famous line would echo through Chinese thought: "Governing a great nation is like cooking a small fish. Handle it with too much heat, and it falls apart. Turn it too often, and it crumbles. The best governance is the kind you barely feel." That line was later written into Laozi's Tao Te Ching, one of China's greatest philosophical works. But the first person in history to draw the connection between cooking and ruling a kingdom was Yi Yin, a cook's insight immortalized in philosophy. Perhaps that is the deepest lesson he left behind. A person who masters a small thing completely can eventually master the greatest thing of all.